What happens when a forgotten empire rewrites the rules of history and then vanishes without leaving a voice behind? I asked myself that as I stood on the edge of the Bactrian plains, wind tugging at my coat, the ruins silent all around me. Beneath my boots were the bones of a kingdom once feared by Persia, a kingdom that brought emperors to their knees, reshaped the Silk Road, and left behind only broken coins and fading murals to tell its story. Who were the Hephthalites? Were they nomads or kings, invaders or diplomats? How did they master trade, war, and religion in lands they never built, yet came to rule? Why did Chinese scribes, Indian scholars, and Persian chroniclers all remember them so differently? And most of all, how could a power that spanned from Central Asia to northern India fall so completely that even its name feels like a whisper in the wind? This is not just a history, it is an expedition into the unknown. We will follow the rise of a people without borders, walk through the ashes of their final battle, hold the silver bowl that remembers what the chronicles do, and by the end, perhaps we will understand why the Hephthalites were not just erased. They became part of everything that followed. Let us begin. The dust clung to my boots as I crossed the endless steppe, a sea of gold and silence stretching into the horizon. The wind here never sleeps. It moves through the grass in slow whispering waves, as if carrying the breath of stories too old for books. It was in this vastness, beneath a cold sky and circling hawks, that I first felt the presence of the Hephthalites. No cities, no monuments, just the sky, the earth, and something hidden between. I followed the dry riverbeds and old caravan trails, the ones too faint to appear on maps. There, on a ridge littered with sun-bleached bones and broken stone, I stopped and listened, not to voices, but to the shape of the land itself. This was not a place you stumble into. This was a threshold. The Hephthalites, they came from beyond the known. Some called them the White Huns. Others confused them with earlier steppe powers. But these were no mere echoes of Attila or the Xiongnu. They were their own tide, rising from the outer edges of history, mysterious, nomadic, and fierce. Their origins remain clouded. Some theories say they descended from the Yuezhi, displaced centuries earlier from the western frontiers of China. Others trace them to the Huns of Central Asia, or a fusion of Indo-European and Altaic peoples migrating through the corridor between the Altai Mountains and the Caspian. But here on the steppe, those theories dissolve like breath in the wind. They were born in the liminal spaces, on horseback, with their homes folded on their backs, packed into carts. Their loyalty was not to cities, but to clans, to blood, to movement. The archaeologist in me searched for signs, the historian looked for names. But the explorer listened to what the silence could tell me, and it told me this. The Hephthalites were a people who defied the borders drawn by scribes. They lived before they were labeled. They gathered beneath the stars, hunting, herding, exchanging goods and genes with those they met along the Silk Road's earliest arteries. And one day they began to organize. Perhaps it started with a single charismatic leader, or a marriage alliance, or a tribal oath made under the eyes of ancestors and horses. Whatever it was, it turned scattered riders into something more, a confederation, a movement, a rising storm on the horizon of empires. Even in Chinese records, they arrive not with a whisper, but with weight. The Book of Wei speaks of the Yetha, a name believed to reference the early Hephthalites, and from those sparse characters we glimpse a portrait of people who were not barbarians, but challengers, observers, opportunists, builders in their own way. Their rise was not a sudden conquest, but a gathering pressure, the kind that builds not over years, but over generations. By the time the great empires began to notice, it was already too late. The Hephthalites were not coming. They were already here. Their banners caught the wind, their horses cut the dust, their eyes turned south, toward Bactria, toward the Sasanian border, toward destiny. And I, standing there on that ancient ridge, felt the pulse of a world just beginning to stir. The Hephthalites were more than warriors. They were a question posed to history itself, and from the steps that whispered their name, they stepped forward to demand an answer. The light was soft that morning in the valleys of Bactria. A mist clung low over the riverbeds, and the distant mountains wore veils of fading snow. I knelt beside a ruined irrigation channel, fingertips brushing the edge of sun-baked brick, and wondered how a nomadic people once ruled these fertile lands with the confidence of kings. This was where the transformation happened. The Hephthalites had once followed herds and winds. They moved with the seasons, living by what the land could offer and what their horses could carry. But here in Bactria, something changed. The grass was richer, the rivers steadier. The trade routes converged in these plains, and so did the destinies of those who sought more than survival. It is easy to imagine them first as raiders, striking from the north with speed and steel, testing the defenses of the settled cities. But conquest alone cannot explain what happened here. The Hephthalites did not simply pillage, they stayed, and that changed everything. They took the cities, but they also took the roads, the tax systems, the harvests. In doing so, they began to govern and then to rule. You can still see it in the ruins near Balkh. The layout of Hephthalite administrative centers built atop older Persian foundations, fragments of inscriptions in multiple languages, Bactrian, Pahlavi, Sanskrit, all reflecting a growing bureaucracy under nomadic hands. But it was not just buildings or ledgers, it was the crown. Somewhere in these valleys, the Hephthalite chiefs began to call themselves kings. They adopted titles in the style of the empires they conquered. Titles like Kushan Shah or King of Kings, reaching back into the language of legitimacy that once belonged to their enemies. And yet, they did not abandon their past. Even as they built courtly halls and collected taxes, they still held councils of nobles under the open sky, still honored the old codes of loyalty and horsemanship. A Hephthalite king might sit on a carved throne, but he never forgot the saddle. It was not imitation, it was fusion. From the grazing grounds came an empire that looked both backward and forward. It honored the tribe, but ruled like a state. It was agile, yet rooted. It was nomadic, yet settled. And it worked. For nearly a century, they held the heart of Central Asia. From the Oxus to the foothills of the Himalayas, their authority grew. Vassal kings paid tribute. Merchants paid tolls. Scribes recorded their decrees on parchment and stone. Their coins tell this story best. Stamped with fire altars and moon symbols, inscribed with names in Sogdian script and Greek letters, these silver pieces carried the weight of a hybrid power, one that belonged to no single tradition but touched them all. Standing in the shadow of a collapsed column, I imagine the marketplace that once filled this space. The clang of iron, the murmur of merchants, the presence of Hephthalite soldiers in layered armor, watching the crowd with alert eyes. They were not outsiders here. They were lords. From tent to palace, from chieftain to sovereign, this was the crucible of their rise. And even now, with the cities silent and the rivers changed, the stones remember the journey from grazing grounds to kingship, did not erase who the Hephthalites were. It revealed what they could become, and in that becoming, they reshaped history. The wind changed as I crossed into Khorasan. The air grew sharper, touched with the scent of stone and forgotten blood. I stood atop a ruined battlement, gazing out across the brown hills, and imagined the armies that once thundered across this frontier. This was where the silence broke. This was where the Hephthalites collided with Persia. It is one thing to rise in the vacuum between empires. It is another to face an empire head-on. And in the 5th century, the Hephthalites did just that. The Sasanian Empire ruled from the heart of Iran, stretching its power east toward the mountains and deserts of Central Asia. It was wealthy, ancient, confident. Its rulers claimed divine sanction. They built palaces of fire and stone, engraved their triumphs in rock. But none of that stopped the horsemen from the north. The Hephthalites came not as shadows, but as challengers. They tested the Persian frontiers with raids, then with demands, then with war, and the empire shook. The first true earthquake came in the year 539, when the Sasanian king Peroz marched north to crush the Hephthalites once and for all. He brought with him a vast army, veterans of past campaigns, nobles in jeweled armor, banners gleaming in the sun. He never returned. The battle's exact site is still debated. Some say it happened near Balkh. Others point to the plains beyond the Oxus. Wherever it was, the result was clear. The Hephthalites lured Peroz into a trap. Their warriors, skilled in steppe tactics, ambushed the Persians. The king was killed, his army destroyed, his empire humiliated. I walked among the gravel and crumbling earthworks near Nishapur, and though the landscape had long since forgotten its wounds, the feeling lingered. This was not just a military victory, it was a shift in power. After Peroz fell, the Hephthalites became kingmakers in Persia. They supported Kavad, Peroz's son, helping him reclaim the throne. In return, they demanded tribute, not once, but annually, for decades. Imagine that. The Persian court, which once viewed nomads as mere nuisances, now bowed to them with silver and silk. In the ancient texts, there is bitterness. Scribes wrote of shame, of tribute paid with clenched fists. But the Hephthalites, they had nothing to prove. They had broken an empire and walked away with its crown in their pocket, yet it was not brute force alone. The Hephthalites knew diplomacy. They arranged marriages, sent envoys, read the temperature of courts better than some kings. Their leaders wore diadems, adopted titles in multiple languages, and moved with an awareness of imperial theater. It was not about plunder, it was about control. And here, in the highlands and deserts where two civilizations once collided, I felt the full gravity of that moment in history. The Hephthalites had achieved something rare. They had not just survived their contact with Persia, they had shaped it. Later, the Sasanian Empire would recover. It would rebuild. It would even reclaim the upper hand. But for those crucial decades, the Hephthalites were in command. Their shadow fell across the Zoroastrian fire temples, across the royal courts of Ctesiphon, across the minds of all who thought the steppe was empty. And as I stood in the fading light, tracing the outlines of shattered walls, I realized this was not a clash of barbarians and kings. This was a clash of kings, and the nomads had won. The morning sun shimmered on the edge of an old caravan route near Termez. The stones were warm under my boots, smoothed by centuries of trade and the weight of countless hooves. I followed the trail slowly, eyes open for fragments. A broken coin, a rusted clasp, the whisper of commerce that once fed empires. And here, in the dust of forgotten markets, I began to see the Hephthalites not just as conquerors, but as economic architects. They understood the value of war, but they also understood the value of trade. Bactria, Tokharistan, Sardiana, these were crossroads. Great rivers and mountain passes funneled caravans from China, India, Iran, and the deep steppes of the north. And once the Hephthalites took control of these regions, they did not simply plunder. They plugged themselves into the arteries of the ancient world, and they let the wealth flow. I came across a half-buried hoard of silver coins, Hephthalite in design, but modeled after Sasanian currency. The same fire altars, the same dignified kings, but the names were different. The language changed. These were not for show. They were meant to circulate, and they did. From the oases of Turfan to the plains of the Punjab, Hephthalite coinage turned up in marketplaces, temple offerings, and royal treasuries. Their money became trusted, even copied. That is the mark of true influence. Not destruction, but circulation. They taxed trade routes. They protected caravans. They minted coins with deliberate multilingual inscriptions. And they positioned themselves as gatekeepers between East and West. But it was not only about silver. There was silk. Chinese silks reached the Hephthalite courts in exchange for horses, jade, lapis, and influence. These silks were not just worn, they were paraded, gifted, embedded into the visual theater of authority. Imagine the Hephthalite court, a nomadic king seated on a gilded platform draped in Sogdian robes, shaded by embroidered Chinese silk, surrounded by nobles whose armor gleamed with Indian gold. That was the visual synthesis of empire. Not built on stone, but on movement, on access, on power expressed through material splendor. And then there was iron. The weapons of the Hephthalites were more than functional. They were symbols. Curved sabers forged in northern workshops, lamellar armor crafted with precision. Their military strength was not random. It was sustained by a steady supply of steppe iron and an infrastructure that ensured their warriors were always prepared. Even their helmets, often depicted in art, bore crescent shapes or high crests, markers not just of protection, but of identity. These were not raiders improvising from the wilderness. These were soldiers backed by an economy that could arm, feed, and reward them. In one dusty corner of a museum in Dushanbe, I held a Hephthalite seal in gloved hands. It bore the image of a mounted noble, sharp features, a heavy torque at the neck, a bow in hand. Around him ran inscriptions in a script blending Sogdian and Bactrian, a signature of trade, a stamp of legitimacy. Everything about the Hephthalite economy pointed to sophistication. They were not builders of marble cities, but they were builders of networks, through markets, through metal, through silk threads stretched across deserts. And as I sat by the fire that night, watching embers drift into the air, I understood. The strength of the Hephthalites was not only in how they fought, it was in how they connected. They turned rivers into roads, mountains into bridges, coins into contracts, cloth into loyalty. And in doing so, they built an empire of motion. I entered the ruins at sunrise. The monastery lay quiet, half swallowed by sand and vines, but its bones still breathed. The arches, though crumbling, reached upward with grace. And on the walls, beneath centuries of dust and lichen, the past remained, painted in strokes of ochre, indigo, and gold. This was Tokharistan, a land where monks once walked in silence, where traders counted coins beneath painted ceilings, and where the Hephthalites left a mark more delicate than iron. It was in the art that I first felt their presence, not the warrior's fury, not the king's command, but something softer, a fusion of beliefs, of aesthetics, of cultures that had passed through these valleys and lingered in pigment and form. I moved carefully down a corridor in the Buddhist complex of Bamiyan, the floor uneven beneath my boots. On the remaining plaster walls, I saw courtly figures dressed in kaftans, long robes with flowing sleeves, adorned with pearls and floral motifs. Their faces were calm, their eyes almond-shaped, and their crowns unmistakable. Crescent-shaped, radiate, Hephthalite, but these were not images of fear, they were portraits of grace. It puzzled me at first. How could these horse lords, so often described in ancient texts as destroyers, be remembered here with such serenity? And then I understood. The Hephthalites were not strangers to culture. They were curators of it. When they settled in cities like Balkh, Kunduz, and Termez, they did not suppress the local traditions, they absorbed them. They supported monasteries, they paid artisans. They allowed Buddhist, Zoroastrian, and even early Hindu elements to coexist in a kind of fragile harmony. In the murals, I saw not just Hephthalite nobility, but the visual echo of exchange. The Iranian world gave them its elegance, India its symbolism, China its flair for detail. The steppe gave them movement, and the Silk Road gave them style, and all of it blended here. In a small chapel, I found the image of a bodhisattva, a figure of compassion, standing beneath a canopy of lotus petals. His skin was painted in delicate shades, his posture relaxed, his gaze serene. But beside him, barely visible, was another figure, a donor, bearded with wide eyes, wearing a pointed cap and fur-lined robe. A Hephthalite noble, perhaps, humble, not imposing. It was a message. Even in the sacred space, the Hephthalites placed themselves not above, but beside. They patronized Buddhist sites without erasing the past. They minted coins with fire altars, even if they did not worship fire themselves. They built cities that kept their old names, even as new rulers rose. Their culture was not about dominance, it was about synthesis. And that synthesis left traces not just on walls, but in everyday objects. Ceramics with blended motifs, jewelry that mixed Sogdian filigree with steppe symbols, statuary that bore the softness of Gupta influence but the angular lines of the steppes. It was everywhere if you looked closely enough. As I sat in the half-light of a broken sanctuary, birds nesting in the rafters above, I felt it all around me. The Hephthalites may not have built towering temples of their own, but they shaped what survived. They passed like a wind through Tokharistan, but they stirred the leaves in ways that never fully settled. Their art was not loud, it was layered, and in those layers we see not just the hand of the painter, but the quiet influence of kings who knew the power of beauty. The trail descended from the mountains in narrow switchbacks, carved into the cliffs by time and feet long vanished. I followed it slowly, feeling the air grow warmer with every step. Snowmelt trickled beside me. Pines gave way to poplars. The sharp wind softened into something heavier, a scent of damp earth, of flowering trees, of monsoon breath far below. And then the view opened. The plains of India stretched wide before me. From these high passes, the Hephthalites descended, not as scattered raiders, but as waves of intent. In Indian history, they are remembered as the Hunas, a name that carried terror in its wake. But they were not a single people. They were clusters, confederations, commanders with different loyalties but similar goals. Among them were the Alshan Huns, whose crescent-crowned helmets would soon become symbols of conquest. Their first forays were sharp and brutal. They struck in bursts, testing borders, raiding forts, burning villages. But they returned, again and again, until resistance fractured. The Gupta Empire, once the golden light of Indian classical civilization, began to flicker. Its armies had grown complacent, its unity strained, and into that breach the Hunas poured. I stood on the outskirts of Mathura, where temples now sit beside broken columns. It was here, and in places like it, that the Hephthalite tide washed deepest. They captured cities, seized tribute. Some say they reached as far as Malwa, others into the heart of Kashmir. But it was not just destruction, they stayed. That was the difference. Where earlier invaders had come to plunder, the Hephthalites lingered. They built their own centers of power, minted their own coins, named their own kings. I held one of those coins once, thick, silver, roughly hammered. On one side, the image of a ruler stylized in profile, crowned and stern. On the other, crude imitations of Indian motifs. The fusion was imperfect, but deliberate. They wanted more than gold. They wanted authority. In the records of Indian scholars, they are painted as villains, harbingers of chaos, destroyers of Dharma. But in archaeology, we find complexity, stone inscriptions that blend Sanskrit with foreign names, temples that bear scars of fire, but also signs of repair, local dynasties that married into invader lines, resistance, yes, but also absorption. It was not a simple invasion, it was a cultural collision. And amid the violence, a strange new synthesis began. Some Hephthalite rulers converted to Hinduism. Others patronized Buddhist sites. Some declared themselves kings of kings, mimicking the very empires they once dismantled. In some courts, their names appear beside local nobles, not in fear, in alliance. The Southward surge was not the end of Indian civilization, but it was a reckoning. It forced change, forced adaptation. It cracked the idea of invulnerability that had surrounded the Gupta elite, and in its wake, new powers emerged. I watched the sunset from a hill above the plains. The fields below shimmered gold, dotted with distant lights from villages still living, still growing. The Hephthalites had come, reshaped, and receded, but their imprint lingered. In names, in bloodlines, in ruins that still speak in fractured tongues. They did not just invade, they entered the story and changed its direction. The sun was low when I reached the stone platform. It jutted from the earth like the spine of something ancient. Not a palace, not a fortress, just a single raised slab cracked and weathered by time. But in the silence around it, I felt the weight of decisions once made here. This was not just a seat, it was a symbol. The Hephthalites were not born into palaces. Their earliest leaders were forged in the saddle, chosen by deeds, not descent. Power did not pass from father to son by right. It passed by strength, by wisdom, by ritual. I stood where a Kagan might have once stood, draped in fur-lined robes, his face marked with the soot of ceremony. Around him, the tribal leaders sat on carpets or crouched beside fires, waiting for words that would bind or break alliances. Leadership among the Hephthalites was not imposed, it was performed. In the traditions of the steppes, the act of crowning was less about the object itself and more about the gathering. Witnesses made kings, oaths sealed them, and blood, sometimes drawn, sometimes spilled, reminded all that power came with cost. Even the crown told a story. Hephthalite rulers wore crescent diadems, high crests, or radiating halos that mimicked divine light. Some were inspired by the old Kushan forms. Others echoed Persian and Central Asian designs. But always there was the mark of movement, of the steppe. I once studied a carved stone found near Kunduz. It showed a regal figure seated cross-legged, flanked by armed guards. In one hand he held a scepter, in the other the reins of a horse. It was not an accident. A Hephthalite king ruled from both throne and saddle. Their rituals were both intimate and intimidating. Some sources suggest the burning of incense before ancestors. Others speak of feasts held under open skies, where bonds were renewed over bowls of fermented mare's milk. And always there were trials. To become a ruler was to survive, physically, politically, spiritually. No court intrigue passed without consequences. No noble stayed secure without loyalty from warriors. The fragile equilibrium of the steppe demanded constant balance. One misstep, and another would rise. But once secured, Hephthalite kings wielded immense influence. They controlled coinage. They led raids. They negotiated with emperors. Some received envoys from China. Others made or broke dynasties in Persia and India. And yet, they still returned to their camps, still sat beside their clansmen, still hunted in the wild to show they had not forgotten who they were. Their authority was never purely royal. It was tribal, performative, conditional, and that made it both resilient and volatile. I think of one figure often, Mihirakula, a Hephthalite king in India, remembered for his cruelty, but also for his audacity. He defied emperors, crushed temples, declared himself lord of all beneath the sky. Was he an outlier, or a reflection of the edge every Hephthalite ruler had to walk? Because when your throne is born of consensus and sharpened by fear, every day is a test, and yet they endured. For over a century, their leaders commanded armies, held territory, and stitched together a patchwork of peoples who should have fractured at the first crisis. But they did not, because the Hephthalite crown was more than metal. It was memory, ceremony, survival. And as I stood on that lonely platform, the wind stirring the dust at my feet, I could almost hear it, not the voice of a king, but the voices of those who chose him. The ruins of an old caravanserai stood before me. Its walls, barely waist-high now, traced a square that once welcomed travelers, soldiers, and strangers bearing gifts. I walked through the empty threshold and into the dust. Here, long before the maps were finished, a different kind of warfare unfolded, one without blades. This was the battlefield of diplomacy. For the Hephthalites, war was never their only language. From their earliest ascents in Bactria to their southern expansions, they understood that power could be taken with a sword, but kept with a letter, a hostage, a gift. I imagined the moment. An envoy dismounts, robes heavy with the dust of distant roads. In his hands, scrolls sealed in wax. Behind him, horses bearing tribute. Silk from China, silk from Persia, lapis from the highlands. His arrival is not announced with fanfare, but with silence. It is a negotiation before it is an offering. And that silence was part of their genius. The Hephthalites mastered a diplomacy of presence. They knew how to wait, how to listen, how to make their absence felt when words would not do. The great courts of the age, Persia, India, and the northern way of China, soon realized the Hephthalites could not be dismissed. Their envoys were everywhere. their influence inescapable. There is a Chinese record from the Northern Wei dynasty. It speaks of a mission from the Hephthalite court, arriving with exotic goods, sharp intellect, and subtle pressure. They came as friends, but they stayed as reminders. But it was not just about gifts, it was about control. When the Sasanians fell to the Hephthalites in battle, they did not just lose soldiers, they lost dignity. And so, each year, silver flowed northward, tribute dressed as diplomacy, but paid in quiet defeat. And when the tables turned, the Hephthalites used the same tools. They accepted gifts from Persia, from Indian vassals, even from Chinese rulers. They built a network of tribute relationships, alliances, and hostages that mirrored the complexity of any settled empire. I once examined a document fragment, weathered, translated from Sogdian script. It hinted at a negotiation between a Hephthalite chief and a local city-state. The terms were not of conquest, but of protection. A promise of peace for a price. This was the Hephthalite way. They let others keep their titles, let them wear their crowns, but only if they remembered who held the reins. They appointed puppet kings, married into dynasties, chose when to strike and when to stand still. A flexible web of influence held together not by force, but by the fear of it. And fear was their most stable currency. In this Game of Thrones, the Hephthalites played all sides, sometimes warriors, sometimes benefactors, sometimes shadows behind the throne. And that strategy bought them something no battle alone could: time. For over 100 years, they sat in the center of an invisible empire, more ephemeral than stone, but no less real. And as I sat in the broken court of that caravanserai, dust curling around my boots, I realized something. Not every conquest is loud. Some are whispered, in sealed rooms, in offered gifts, in silences that bend kings to their knees. The morning fog lay thick over the Oxus River. I stood on a narrow ridge above its banks, watching the current move like molten glass, slow, relentless. Beneath that surface, the river carried silt and memory alike. Civilizations had risen here and vanished just as quietly, but this was where the current changed. For the Hephthalites, the Oxus had once been a lifeline. It marked territory, connected trade routes, and mirrored their rise. But by the mid-6th century, the river's reflection told a different story. New figures appeared on the horizon. From the east they came in waves. Horsemen with wolf standards, with fur-trimmed coats and sharp eyes. They were the Turks, the first Turkic Khaganate, and they were not interested in tribute. They came for dominance. I found remnants of their early camps in the grasslands near Samarkand, charred earth, bronze arrowheads, pieces of tack leather hardened by age. They did not leave cities behind them. They left warnings. The Turks had watched the Hephthalites grow fat on empire. They had seen the tributes from Persia, the alliances with India, the control of caravan roads. And they wanted it. Not the cities, not the temples, the power. And they moved fast. At the same time, the Sasanians were stirring. Humiliated for decades, Persia had recovered its strength. Under the rule of Khosrow Anushirvan, a king both shrewd and ruthless, they sought revenge. But this time, they did not march north alone. The unthinkable happened. Persia and the Turks, once enemies, once competitors, joined hands. Their diplomats met in cold camps and quiet chambers, and what they forged was not just an alliance, it was a trap. A two-front war was something even the Hephthalites could not withstand. From the west, Persian legions crossed into Hephthalite territory with precision. From the east, Turkic cavalry stormed the highlands with fire and iron. Cities fell, fortresses broke, allies turned silent. I explored one of those fallen fortresses, a site near Balkh. Its walls, blackened and cracked, stood only waist-high now. The courtyard was choked with weeds, but scattered in the dirt were fragments of fine pottery, coins, and arrowheads from both sides of the conflict. There had been resistance, but it had not been enough. The Hephthalites, once masters of the frontier, were now trapped by it. Their flexibility, their diplomacy, their shifting alliances, none of it could hold back a storm that came from every direction. The tide had turned, not all at once, not with a single battle, but with a slow crumbling like ice breaking apart beneath your feet. They retreated where they could, split into factions. Some rulers clung to isolated cities, others fled deeper into the hills. There was no final stand, no glorious last charge, just the sound of hooves fading into the steppe. And yet, in that silence, I felt something strange. The Hephthalites had once risen by reading the winds of power. They knew when to fight, when to yield, when to vanish. Now, the wind had shifted again. It did not erase them, it scattered them. And as I stood beneath a twilight sky, the Oxus gleaming like a blade in the distance, I thought, even the fiercest riders must one day dismount. Even the loudest empires fall quietly. The wind was dry as I entered the hollow shell of the fortress near Bukhara. Its outer walls were fractured, jagged like broken teeth. Inside, silence ruled. No banners, no guards, just the slow creak of age pressing down. But beneath that silence, there was the residue of something final. This was where it ended. Not in a single city, not on one battlefield, but across the map, like a candle guttering out in stages. The fall of the Hephthalites was not sudden, but it was complete. For decades, they had defied the odds. They had carved power from uncertainty, bent empires to their will, and held the center of a world in motion. But they could not withstand the one thing they had so often avoided: unity. When the Sasanians and the Turks formed their alliance, it was not just strategy, it was revenge. The Persians had been paying tribute to the Hephthalites for years, humiliated, bruised, watching a nomadic power control lands they considered sacred. The Turks, meanwhile, were eager to claim the trade routes, the tribute flows, the territory their neighbors had long monopolized. So they conspired, and they struck. From the west came the armies of Khosra Anushirvan, well-organized, disciplined, driven by memory and motive. From the east came the Turks, fast, feral, relentless. The Hephthalite confederation fractured. Old allies broke away. Some local rulers declared themselves independent. Others fled before the storm arrived. Even the central rulers, once feared across continents, could not rally their strength in time. I followed an ancient road into a ravine near Merv, where one of the final battles is believed to have taken place. There were no monuments, no plaques, just windswept stones and the scent of crushed sagebrush. But I could feel it. A collapse is not always thunderous. Sometimes it happens like breath leaving a room. One city burns, another surrenders, a leader disappears, a messenger never returns, and slowly, a people once feared begin to fade. The Persians took what they wanted: territory, tax rights, vengeance. The Turks, now ascendant, claimed the northern trade routes and expanded westward. The Hephthalite heartland, the lands of Bactria, Tokharistan, and beyond, was carved, claimed, and forgotten by the same hands that once feared it. There was no final proclamation, no surrender carved into stone. The empire simply ceased to exist, but fragments lingered. In the southern mountains, small Hephthalite polities tried to survive. Their leaders styled themselves as kings. They minted coins in their own name. They carried on rituals, spoke old dialects, preserved a memory of greatness. But they were no longer empire. They were echoes. I sat at dusk on a crumbling wall, a fire lit at my side, the stars beginning to pierce through the veil of twilight. The wind carried the same silence it had always carried, soft, unspoken, ancient. And in that silence, I felt no triumph, only transition. The Hephthalites had risen from the edge of maps, challenged the mightiest thrones of their time, and bent the known world around their will. But in the end, even they could not hold history still. The fatal coalition crushed what conquest could not. And in that crushing, the dust of an empire returned to the steppe. The morning was cool as I moved through the lower valleys of Tokharistan. Light filtered through almond trees, and the call of distant herders echoed off the stone. This land, quiet now, was once alive with the rumble of hooves and the language of kings. But the empire that once ruled here was gone. What remained were fragments. After the great collapse, after the fatal coalition broke the back of Hephthalite power, not all was erased. In the shadows of old strongholds, on the edges of memory, smaller kingdoms emerged, offspring of a shattered throne. They called themselves kings. Not emperors, not khagans, just kings. And even that title hung lightly. I stood in the ruins of one such kingdom near the city of Kapisa. The stone foundations were modest. A few pillars still reached upward, but scattered in the soil were coins, silver, stamped with crescents and rough inscriptions. Some bore names we do not know. Others, half legible, hinted at rulers trying to reclaim a past that no longer existed. These were the Hephthalite remnants. Factions that had survived the storm, holding fast to identity in a world that no longer feared them. Some clung to the highlands, fortifying valleys and controlling trade along narrow passes. Others became vassals, first to the Turks, then to rising Islamic powers, later still to local Afghan dynasties. Their autonomy was partial, their authority fragile, but they endured. In the records of Chinese travelers like Xuanzang, we hear mention of small Hephthalite rulers still active in the 7th century. They maintained courts, kept scribes, sent envoys. They were no longer dominant, but they had not vanished. Their cities shrank, their armies thinned, but their memory lingered in ritual. Coins remained an anchor. Minted in shrinking quantities, they often imitated Sasanian styles. A fire altar, a crown, a name scrawled in a script already losing its precision. But in that imitation was defiance, a quiet refusal to be forgotten. In the temple walls of Bamiyan and the shrines of the Swat Valley, the art changed subtly. The grand murals gave way to simpler forms. The vibrant faces of the Hephthalite period faded, replaced by newer motifs. And yet, here and there, a crown shape, a horse archer, a fragment of something older peeked through. Echoes. I spoke to a local historian in the mountains beyond Badakhshan. He pointed to place names, remote villages whose names bore the rhythm of Hephthalite rulers. He traced old family lines, oral traditions passed down in dusty rooms. None of it could be confirmed, but none of it felt false. Because the Hephthalites did not die in a single blow. They dissolved, into local cultures, into mountain tribes, into memories that refuse to leave. Some intermarried with the Turks, others were absorbed into early Islamic polities. Their language shifted, their rituals changed, but something remained, a posture, a style, a silence. I walked back toward the river as the sun rose higher, scattering light across the ruins, and I thought of what history often forgets. Not all empires end in fire. Some break into pieces, and those pieces continue, quietly, on their own terms. The Hephthalite kingdoms after date were not powerful, but they were stubborn. They were the last breath of a people who had once ruled from the Caspian to the Ganges, and even in their decline, they still called themselves kings. The stone was small, weathered, almost nothing at first glance. But when I leaned closer, brushing away the dust with slow fingers, the faint curves of script emerged. Not one language, but two, maybe more. Bactrian, Sogdian, perhaps a hint of Sanskrit beneath the surface. A single artifact, a single voice, caught in the turning tide of identity. That was the Hephthalites. After the fall, after the cities dimmed and the banners fell, the question remained, what does a people become when their empire ends? I traced those worn letters slowly, feeling not just the language but the confusion within it, because the Hephthalites had always existed between worlds. They were never purely Turkic, never fully Iranian, never solely Central Asian or Indian. Their identity was built in motion across valleys, across empires, across tongues. And as they declined, that identity did not disappear, it transformed. In the coins they struck, you see it clearly. Names in Bactrian, but using Sasanian titles. Inscriptions in Sanskrit, but bearing Central Asian iconography. Language was no longer a single mirror, it was a prism. In one region, Hephthalite rulers spoke the tongue of their new overlords. In another, they clung to the language of their ancestors, even as the script began to shift. Some seals bear personal names that are clearly Iranian, others with hints of Turkic roots, and some are impossible to pin down. I walked through a mountain pass where Hephthalite envoys once traveled, carrying messages across kingdoms. The echoes of their voices still seemed to cling to the air, and I wondered, what language did they speak? To their horses, to their gods, to their children. Language was a survival tool. It shifted with the audience. A ruler might speak 3 or 4 tongues. He had to. His people were a patchwork. But even beyond language, identity itself began to flow. The Hephthalites no longer had one court, one king, one clear center. So each region adapted. In some areas, they adopted the religious customs of their neighbors. In others, they held on to steppe traditions, burial mounds, ancestor rites, the sacred nature of the horse. Some became Buddhists, some followed Zoroastrianism. Later, a few likely converted to Islam. It was not a loss of culture. It was a reshaping. I met a scholar in Kabul who showed me a ceramic shard found near an old monastery. On it was a name, probably Hephthalite, but written in a local Brahmi script. It had been part of a donation, perhaps. A noble's offering to a faith not originally their own. This is how the Hephthalites survived after their fall. They did not stand still. They did not fossilize. They became rivers, not statues. Their identity became layered, sometimes contradictory, sometimes fluid, but always evolving. And in that evolution was strength. Even today, in the folk traditions of Afghanistan, in the tribal memories of the Pamirs, you can find ghost lines, names that stretch back to Hephthalite ancestors, songs that mention crescent crowns, myths of riders from the north. They are not called Hephthalites anymore, but the rhythm remains, and as I left that stone tablet behind, its letters fading back into shadow, I realized, a people does not vanish because its name is forgotten. Sometimes, it just learns to speak in a different voice. It was locked behind glass, under soft museum light. A silver bowl no larger than my outstretched hands, carved with images that refused to sit still. Riders in mid-gallop, their bows drawn, their hair caught in the wind. Stylized mountains rolled beneath their horses. Above them, birds flew in perfect formation. I leaned in close, and for a moment, they moved. This was a Hephthalite bowl, found in the Swat Valley, made not for function, but for memory. Across Central and South Asia, the Hephthalites left few written records. No grand libraries, no vast stone inscriptions declaring their conquests. But what they left behind were things, objects, carvings, coins, seals, bowls like this one, where history whispered not in words, but in images. That bowl had weight, not just in silver, but in meaning. It told a story. The riders were nobility. You could tell by their posture, their weapons, their dress, fine caftans and crescent crowns. One held a falcon, another a horn. This was a scene not of war, but of ceremony, a celebration, perhaps a royal hunt, perhaps something older, a rite remembered from the steppes. And yet, carved on silver, it had been transformed. It was more than a steppe echo, it was a message. In another museum case, I found a seal, round, palm-sized, made of carved stone. The image was simple: a mounted archer, bow raised. Around him, inscriptions in a fusion of scripts, Sogdian letters intertwined with early Bactrian, the style unmistakably Hephthalite. This was not art for beauty's sake, it was authority. Seals like this marked documents, stamped contracts, authenticated goods. They were the signatures of power, and in their designs you saw what the Hephthalites valued: speed, sovereignty, the horse and the bow, and identity held in the hand. Even their coins were more than currency, they were political statements. One coin I examined bore the face of a king, stern, bearded, crowned in rays. On the reverse, the fire altar flanked by attendants. A Persian image, but not Persian in origin. The name was foreign, the execution rough. This was a Hephthalite imitation, deliberate and bold. They had taken the iconography of their former enemies and made it their own, because to control an image is to control its meaning. In these artifacts, the Hephthalites were not simply recording their existence, they were shaping how they wished to be remembered. Some objects speak in contradiction. A ceramic plate with Indian lotus designs, flanked by Central Asian horsemen. A gold pendant with Kushan script, worn by a Hephthalite princess. A carved ivory comb bearing both Buddhist and nomadic motifs. None of it fits neatly. The Hephthalites were never one thing. Their empire was stitched together by trade, war, diplomacy, and art, and their artifacts reflect that tension between movement and settlement, between tradition and adaptation. Each object, each seal, each bowl is a window. And when I looked through them, I did not see an empire falling. I saw a people remembering, carving themselves into silver, pressing their mark into stone, telling stories the world tried to forget. So even now, centuries later, in quiet museum halls or buried beneath village earth, they are still speaking. You only have to know how to listen. The streets of the city were warm with dust and color. Children ran between market stalls, The call of vendors echoed under cracked archways. And above it all, the old citadel stood quiet, its silhouette softened by time, its history wrapped in too many names. This place had once been Hephthalite. Now it was something else, but beneath the surface, they remained. Empires rarely die all at once. They dissolve, seeping into the soil of successor states, their traditions surviving not in monuments but in gestures, in names, in the curve of a helmet, in the shape of a story passed from one generation to the next. The Hephthalites may have lost their empire, but they were never erased. In the early Islamic chronicles, they are mentioned with caution, referred to as former kings, as mountain lords, as rulers of forgotten cities, sometimes as allies. Their name changes, Haytal, Abdali, but the shadow is unmistakable. In Afghanistan and parts of northern India, dynasties rose claiming descent from Hephthalite lines. Whether true or convenient, the association held power. Bloodlines were currency, and the memory of horse lords who once shook empires was valuable. I visited a hilltop shrine above Herat where local lore spoke of ancestors who had once ridden from the north, pale-faced and sword-armed. No written proof, just stories told with reverence. That's how legacy survives. The Abdali tribe, later known as the Durrani, founders of modern Afghanistan, may carry a thread from those days, not in certainty, but in suggestion, in the idea that something ancient flows in their veins. Even in art, the echoes persist. I traced patterns on a robe displayed in a provincial museum, floral motifs interlaced with crescent crowns, a design passed down through workshops across generations. Was it still Hephthalite, or had the original meaning been lost? Perhaps it does not matter. Legacy is not a straight line. It twists, it breaks, it survives in fragments stitched into other stories. Hephthalite tactics lived on in Turkic warfare. Their use of diplomacy, of hostages, tribute, flexible loyalty, became the playbook of many later nomadic powers. Even their coins were restruck for years after their fall, used by rulers who had never known their name. I stood in a marketplace near Balkh, watching traders haggle over rugs and spices. It felt timeless, and I wondered how many of them carried the blood of forgotten kings. Because that's how absorption works, not with conquest, with blending, with children who speak new languages but remember old songs, with cities that change rulers but keep the same festivals, with empires that fall but never leave. The Hephthalites did not vanish. They became part of what followed, the empires of Islam, the dynasties of the Hindu Kush, the tribal confederations of Central Asia, each one, unknowingly, carrying something of them. And perhaps that is the final shape of power, not to be remembered as a monument, but as a rhythm, flowing beneath the surface, shaping the world long after your name is gone. The fire cracked softly beside me as the last light faded behind the mountains. Above, the sky opened, vast, endless, strewn with stars, the kind of sky you only see in the highlands, where history breathes low and slow, and time does not rush. I sat alone on the edge of a cliff, boots still dusty, notebook open but forgotten, and I thought about the Hephthalites. Not just what they conquered, but what they became. They had no marble palaces, no libraries carved into cliffs. Their names were etched in silver, painted in frescoes, pressed into coins that traveled farther than their armies ever did. But more than anything, they lived in the in-between, between languages, between faiths, between the known and the forgotten. They rose from the edges of empires, invisible to those who measured power only in walls and laws. And when they vanished, they did so not with a scream, but with a murmur, scattering into other worlds, other names, other stories. What remains are fragments: a bowl buried in Swat, a seal traded in Samarkand, a mural fading in Bamyan. Pieces, clues, echoes. And perhaps that is how history wishes it. Not every people is meant to be immortalized in stone. Some are meant to be felt. The Hephthalites remind us that power is not always loud, that identity does not need borders, that an empire can shape the world even as it disappears into it. They ruled by speed and silence, by sword and seal. They moved like wind through tall grass, visible only when they passed. And now, it is up to us to trace those paths, to kneel beside the ruins, to hold the broken coins, to listen, because history does not always whisper. Sometimes it waits. And when we follow its trail, patiently, humbly, with open eyes, we begin to see what was never truly lost, just buried. And so, beneath the endless sky, I close this chapter. But the journey continues. There are more ruins to find, more names to remember, more echoes waiting in the silence.